Hello, and welcome to our Syxsense July Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have industry expert Rob Brown to give us an inside look at the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add those to the chat. Rob will reach out after to answer them. With that, I'll pass it over to Rob.
Thanks, Kristen, and welcome everybody to the July Patch Tuesday webcast. We are now in the second half of the year. I can't believe how quickly it's gone. I look back and I think we've done this webinar for about 3 years. And in that time, we've had some really crazy Patch Tuesday releases. This actually happens to be one of them, but we're going to get into it. We're going to start with some end of life news. Now we're going to cover these until the end of this year because Windows 10 21H2 did go end of life last month. We are aware there are still a lot of customers still using 21H2. If you haven't yet planned to get to 22H2, do shoot us an email to customersuccess@syxsense.com and we'll send you across our playbook. And that playbook will allow you to upgrade automatically from 21H2 to 22H2. Even if you have Windows 10 machines that are older than 21H2, as long as they are not older than 20H1, we will be able to supply you with a playbook to automatically upgrade you to the latest version. You do have until the 14th of October next year to migrate from Windows 10 to Windows 11. So officially Windows 10 next year will go end of life on the 14th of October. We do have Windows 12 customers still using the ESU extension. That's licenses 1, 2, and 3. You have until the 10th of October 2026 to move all of your servers from 2012 over to 2022, which is our recommended server operating system. But you still have patch support for all of the operating systems in the middle. For Windows 11, for the current version of the feature update 23H2, you've got till November 2026. I often get questions from a lot of viewers asking me where these dates come from. Actually, I do not have a clue. Why is it the 14th of October, 10th of October, 10th of November? I don't really know. But we're going to keep talking about the end of life because I know the strategy from migrating from Windows 10 to 11 from a server OS to the next one isn't so simple. There's not always a quick fix, an in-place upgrade. There are a lot of software that are using these systems that have to be planned. So we're going to give you as much notice as we can. Now, if you're using long-term servicing branch, which is very, very popular, you don't actually need to worry about any of these end of lives because you probably got until 2030 to get all of your systems upgraded. Caesar released their usual warnings this week as well. Adobe did release a rather small list of updates. Strangely enough, Adobe Reader was not included, but they did include updates for Adobe Premiere Pro, Adobe InDesign, and Adobe Bridge, which they're saying a threat actor could exploit some of the vulnerabilities to take control of an affected system. I just did a check. There is no confirmed weaponization of these threats. In fact, there's no confirmed public aware threats either, just that potentially there is a chance of exploit. Now, I mentioned we had the craziest Patch Tuesday yesterday. Just a couple of months back, we had the very largest Patch Tuesday that I've ever hosted a Patch Tuesday webinar for, which was 147 vulnerabilities. And I've been talking about that being an anomaly, that we wouldn't really expect that number to be as high again. And for the last 2 months, we've had our updates in the 50s and 60s, which is kind of normal. And then woe was us. Yesterday, we had 138, right back up there, which makes the number of fixes much higher, which means we have more deployments to do. Those deployments are larger sized binaries. We have to plan and stage out those patches to our estate so that we don't use any overuse the network links, And also we have to perform extra testing. Now, we did have 5 of the fixes that were ranked as critical, 133 were important, the rest were just moderate. Up on last month, we had 13 which were more likely to be weaponized. So of 138, that's not bad. 2 of them were weaponized. 1 is public aware. The one that is public aware isn't weaponized, which is good because when you have the 2 together, it's kind of an extra risk. And we had 2 vulnerabilities which have a jump point. And if you're following us on the CVSS system, that's where we call a scope is changed. And we're going to go into more details very soon on this. So bug types, we are back to remote code execution being the number 1. For the last month, we had a temporary number 1 with elevation of privilege vulnerability, but this time it's back to the top. This is the most serious type of bugs that are fixed. Now, over the last 2 decades, we've been delivering patch management services, vulnerability management services, and every customer that is onboarded to our service is able to use the strategy that best suits their environment. And we're going to give you some advice today, as we have done so for all of our Patch Tuesday webinars, using several different methodologies of selection. So you might be using criticality, you might be using severity, you might be using bug type as a selection criteria. And this is why bug types are a very important selection criteria, because depending on the bug type depends on the risk that that bug type has to your organization. And we said remote code execution is back to number 1, 59. In fact, 59 fixes for one particular bug type was more than last month's combined fixes for Patch Tuesday. That's kind of crazy. Now, remote code execution is a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands to place malware or malicious code on your computer or network. That's why it's the most serious. So if you are not using Syxsense and you need a method of selecting vulnerabilities to deploy, if you are not able to deploy all of the updates at once, then remote code execution may be one of the selection criteria for the most important type of update you need to remediate in your organization. Elevation of privilege is the threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants himself access to data they're not supposed to have. We have 24 fixes followed by 24 security feature bypass as well. That's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. Our last 3, denial of service, which is simply meant to shut down the device or to stop it working, making it inaccessible. Information disclosure, which is a program that unintentionally reveals sensitive information, such as a memory leak or a CPU leak, where you're able to read what is going through in real time, followed by spoofing, which is an act of disguise, disguising a communication or identity. We also had one of the largest releases of SQL as well that we've had for a very long time. In fact, when we look at the list, you'll just notice that there's probably as many SQL fixes as there are anything else. That's kind of interesting as well, because last month we didn't have any. And we kind of suggested last month, based on there only being 4 bug types fixed. If you go back to our webinar last month, we actually only had the top 4 bug types fixed in the entire release. We had no information disclosure, we had no spoofing at all. Of course, we thought we would get an out of band release because it seemed rather strange that there was such a small number of updates. Of course, they were probably saving it up for this Patch Tuesday. So we have a lot to deal with today. Now, in addition to using the bug type, this would be our recommended methodology for prioritizing the patches that you need to release. We call this our 6 score. It's based on vendor severity. Now, vendor severity does differ between Microsoft and some third parties, but they're generally similar. You have critical, high, or important, medium, low, and NA. Obviously, the critical being the very most serious and NA being the least serious. And we have the CVSS score, which is a calculation out of 10. And the vendor themselves can calculate, but also you have an independent body that is able to put the vulnerability through a particular calculator, and out comes a number. 10 is the most critical and 0 being the least critical. Now, when you combine these two severities together, you get a better transparent selection criteria on a severity. Some vendors will come out with a important severity, and CVSS will say, no, this is a CVSS score 9.0, which makes it critical. If you combine the two, you add the data together, you have a better selection and a more accurate selection on what you need to deploy to keep your environment safe. The next two are the states of the vulnerability. Weaponization means it's used in an active exploit. Now, the vendor can tell us, but we can also collect this data from our antivirus partners. So there's a database of CVEs that are being detected as used in an active attack. And we can collect this data, and we can listen to our third party and Microsoft as well to help us build more data that you can use to make intelligent decisions about what you do, what vulnerabilities you are remediating. For example, sometimes Google will release a out-of-band release of their browser that is 0-day and vendor severity NA. Kind of strange, but sometimes it happens. Without having the weaponized status counted as that selection criteria, you might not have deployed it. So that's why it's very important. Public aware does not mean it's announced on a webinar like this. It means that somebody has, through the correct process, released an article or a bug bounty program that is actually identifying exactly how to exploit the vulnerability. Call it a blueprint. So if you have the blueprint, you know how to exploit it. It doesn't always mean it will become weaponized, just that it's public aware. In fact, a lot of public aware vulnerabilities never do get weaponized, simply because it's very, very difficult sometimes. And you have to have a very specific set of steps that you have to go through in order to weaponize it. But it's really useful to know what is public aware. And I certainly want to be an IT manager that knew something was public aware, wasn't yet weaponized, and decided not to remediate it. Even if it's not possible to remediate in the first round, maybe in the second round, that would be an ideal candidate. When we talk about rounds, we talk about the priority of deployment. Sort of back in the day, you would have to select your updates and push them all at once, and that can cause a lot of end user disruption. It can obviously use the network and the internet, and that can become easily saturated. So we can band these updates based on the severity, the CVSS score, the weaponization, and the public aware, and can put them into different deployments to allow us to roll out these updates safely to our organization without interrupting the user too much and without causing any network bandwidth issues. So you don't have to deploy everything at once, and sometimes it's better to sort of stage those out in criticality order. Now, we want to counterbalance that risk with our countermeasures, and there are actually some countermeasures that we can deploy to your organization with this latest Patch Tuesday. So countermeasures are usually two things. You've got a mitigation, which might be that you've got the next generation antivirus and you are fully protected. Could be that your hard drives are encrypted and you are fully protected. You also have workarounds. Now, workarounds could become a simpler solution if it was the stopping of a service or adding of a group policy object or changing of a local registry key. That can counteract the vulnerability, and that can be much, much quicker deployed than a 1.5 gigabyte patch. So when there are countermeasures, do read the countermeasures on the URL, on the link. Find out if you can deploy the countermeasure. Using Syxsense, you can deploy many countermeasures to give you more time to plan the rollout of the patch. Please, though, if you have deployed any countermeasures, please make sure you read the details from the vendor to undo those countermeasures if the patch has been deployed and the vendor recommends that you should. So in the event of a point and print, we may have recommended that you disable the print service. And if the print spooler is left disabled, you can't print. If you've patched the point and print, maybe you don't need to disable the service any longer because the patch protects you. So do make sure you read that. And we take everything into consideration around your exposure. If you've got vulnerabilities which are maybe not as severe, not as high CVSS score on just a couple of % of your devices, but you have a weaponized vulnerability that is public aware, that is lower in severity with no countermeasures on a high percentage of your environment, that should probably be the patch that you deploy to your organization. Now, we're going to go into the list of actual vulnerabilities in priority order. And if you're new to the webinar, you don't have to wait for this this webinar to go through the results. We'd love you to join us. We actually put everything directly up on our website on Patch Tuesday. So if you head across to syxsense.com, and along the top, you've got our resources page. Now, our resources page is where you'll find all of our other events that we're running, all of the other webinars. We've got plenty of webinars where we try to educate the industry around vulnerability management, around third-party patching, security, script detection and remediation as well. If you do have any questions, use the chat function in the corner here and just ask us if we got any white papers on anything such as patch testing or patch strategy, best practices. Do use the chat function and ask for those. You'll also find a whole bunch of stuff under the resources page as well. If you go to the webinar section, you'll find the Patch Tuesday article. It always has a URL of the month, the year, and Microsoft patch Tuesday. If you want to go to it each time, please do. Now, we said we had a big Patch Tuesday. Actually, it was it took me quite a long time to write this Patch Tuesday article last night. It was about half an hour late than it usually was, simply because we had so many different vulnerabilities that I was trying to identify what the risks were and which ones I would prioritize. And I've actually chosen 3 from the list that I would like to talk about very specifically. Now, we did have 2 weaponized vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, and actually 4 vulnerabilities that had a CVSS score of 9.8. Now, like as I mentioned, just a couple of months back, we had the largest Patch Tuesday. This is the second largest. Which is really interesting because they don't usually come this close together, but it covers pretty much everything from Windows to Windows components, Office. We have some Azure updates in there, tons and tons of SQL Server, like I mentioned, Visual Studio, Remote Desktop, if you're still using Remote Desktop, Hyper-V, and Secure Boot. Now, I'm an analytics person. I like to track things from month to month. I took all of the vulnerabilities that were fixed by Microsoft. I counted up all of the individual CVSS scores together, and it gave me a total of 1,087. It's not been that high, I think, I can ever remember. And the reason it was so high is because the average score from that entire release was 7.9. That CVSS score 7.9. Out of 10, that means on average, these vulnerabilities fix more critical vulnerabilities than ever before. So let's take a look at some of these. My first selection is for Hyper-V. Now that is CVE 2024-38080. This is an elevation of privilege vulnerability, which is the second most serious kind of bug fix. Now, this was anonymously submitted to Microsoft, which means they don't, probably means it was an antivirus organization that submitted it. to do with the elevation of privilege vulnerability. Now they're saying if successfully exploited, the vulnerability could allow attacker to gain system privileges, posing a significant risk to system obviously being admin. Microsoft give it a severity of important with a CVSS of 7.8. This is one of the weaponized ones that we had in the list. Now its risk factor, not so serious, but still, because it's weaponized, we need to prioritize it. Its attack vector is local, which means you need to get access to your network in order to exploit it. It's not something that can be exploited over the internet. But it has low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction at all, and no jump point. I actually did a little write-up on this here as well, the implications of not listening to our advice. Please use that in any change control that you're submitting for justifying the deployment of this patch. My second selection today is CVE 2024-35264. This is a .NET and Visual Studio remote code execution vulnerability. This one affects .NET and Visual Studio, and an attacker can exploit this by closing the HTTP-3 stream while a request body is being processed, leading to a race condition and potentially allowing remote code execution. We talked about remote code execution. What does that mean? Ransomware. So definitely a very serious vulnerability to address. This, funnily enough, was only marked important by Microsoft, but has a CVSS score of 8.1. It is public aware, so somebody on the internet has provided the exact steps to exploit it. It does not have a countermeasure, unfortunately. Now, its risk factor is very high. It can attack across any network, including the internet. So if these servers are accessible from the internet, then they can be attacked from the internet. Attack complexity is high, so you do need to have a rather sophisticated attack strategy, but it requires no privileges, no user interaction at all. So if you have an internet-facing .NET or Visual Studio server, please make sure you patch this urgently. I have written up here for your change control to justify why you are deploying this in your patching strategy. And finally, I'm going to give you of the three choices, my last and third choice is actually 3 vulnerabilities. They're all the same. CVE 2024-38074, 38076, and 38077. This is a Windows Remote Desktop Licensing Service remote code execution vulnerability. Again, very serious, used in ransomware attacks. This particular vulnerability was marked as vendor critical. So vendor severity critical, totally justified. CVSS score 9.8 for all 3. Very, very serious. It isn't weaponized and it isn't public aware yet. There is, however, a countermeasure. So if you are using Windows Desktop Licensing Service, I will explain what that is. The Windows Remote Desktop Licensing Server, where this service can be running, but this service can be running on any Windows Desktop Licensing Server, is a component with the Windows Server operating system. So it doesn't have to be remote desktop. It can be on any server. And it manages and distributes the Remote Desktop Service Client Access License, also known as a CAL. So when you're using Windows RDP on a server estate, you have to have CAL licenses for the number of sessions that you're running on your servers. It plays a very crucial role in ensuring that users and devices using Remote Desktop are properly licensed. So in this scenario, if you're using Windows 11 to Windows Server 2022 Windows RDP, you probably have a licensing server. If that licensing server has any internet capable access, very, very serious. Now, if you if you have servers and you need to deploy this to, please do this absolutely urgently. If you want to temporarily offer a workaround, then you can go ahead and disable the licensing service. Stopping the service isn't good enough. because if the server gets rebooted, it will actually automatically start it on the restart. So with Syxsense, you can actually create a playbook, go ahead and disable the service, and then go and re-enable the service after you finish patching. Now, as I mentioned, I've written up a change control here as well. The fact that this can be attacked across any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, and no user interaction very much worries me, especially if you have servers that you hardly ever use, that you're just that are there, no one really logs onto them that much. Super serious. If you have any of these, go ahead and scan your environment for this kind of service. Find out if this service is running on any of your servers and protect yourselves. Now, I have put all of the other vulnerabilities in this neat little sheet down here, listing them in priority order. So from the top, this is the CVE that I'd recommend you look for first. If you're not a Syxsense customer, it's perfectly fine. Take the CVE, pop it into your tool set, write down the exposure. Do that for, say, half of these. There's quite a lot, actually. So probably do them for about 25. Write down the ones that you have the highest exposure, and then start rolling those out in first wave, and then second wave, third wave, etc. We include all the information you need, including some additional details that we think is very important. So we're not expecting you to go to Microsoft to click these links. Actually, just go ahead and read these additional details, and it will offer you additional risk. Just want to mention, we did have a huge number of vulnerabilities for SQL. I know we just have a second left. This vulnerability here, 20701, is so similar to all of the others that have been fixed yesterday. SQL native client, OLEDB, also OLEDB with no space. I don't know what the difference is, but there's a lot of vulnerabilities that fix both one and the other. They have an important severity, CVSS score of 8.8. And if an attacker could exploit their vulnerability by tricking a user into connecting to a malicious SQL server, then they're able to exploit the vulnerability. Remember, a remote code execution is what is used typically in ransomware attacks. So please, if you have any SQL servers, do go ahead and deploy these as quickly as possible. And with that, if there is any more questions I can answer, please do put them in the chat. We always get back to everybody with an answer very privately. If you're going to be at Black Hat later on this year, please do stop by and say hello. If you're thinking about going and you are a Syxsense customer and haven't yet booked a space, please do message us, because we can sponsor you and we can get you an actual ticket for it. And if you're and if we run out of tickets, then we can actually give you some vouchers as well to make it easier to attend. We'd love to see you come by our booth. Also, if you have any other questions about using Syxsense on our website, you can download a trial or start a demo, and we'd love to see you in the when we onboard you as a Syxsense customer. Thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Next time it will be in August. Hopefully it'll be still as sunny as it is now. The sun finally has arrived. But until then, I wish you the best and happy patching. Thank you.